Hi, I'm Rick Young. I'm here to take you through the essential operation of Final Cut Pro X, all the important things that you really need to know to make the system work for you. Now, I've been lucky enough in my time to have used many different editing systems. I started cutting film, moved on to tape suites, from there to nonlinear systems including the original Final Cut Pro, and now on to Final Cut Pro X. Final Cut Pro X is pretty much what I use these days for all of my work. It's quick, it's efficient, and it just gets things done in a really streamlined way. So if you've used other editing systems in the past, open up your mind to a new way of working. There's some real bonuses that the system brings to it, particularly the speed, and don't think that you compromise along the way. It's just really streamlined compared to some of the old ways of working. And if you're new to editing, get ready to step into what is basically the most modern system out there, in my opinion, and just a way to get things done with speed, precision and effectiveness. Okay, to begin with, we need to start with system preferences. Now, it's not really the most exciting place to start, but I will make the point that getting things set up right from the onset is a really good way to ensure that things flow properly once you're deep into the editing process. Okay, let's have a look at system preferences. So you go to your Mac, and the first thing you do is go to the dock, click the application Final Cut Pro, and you'll see the splash screen and the system will open up. Okay, so what we've got here to begin with, as you can see, that we've got two hard drives, my 15-inch SSD, which is what I've actually got inside the machine as the boot drive, and then I've got footage library, and if I just reveal the desktop, you'll see that footage library is my hard drive. That's basically the hard drive which I'm going to be working from. That's what will contain my media. If I bring in any media, I'll store it on that hard drive, and that's the drive I want to work with. Okay, so dealing with preferences, go to the Final Cut Pro menu and choose Preferences, and you'll get a pane that opens up with three separate areas. Now, I deliberately work from right to left, import, playback and editing, simply because you've got to get your content in import first before you do any work. Playback, you've got to be able to check your content, and editing, you need to be able to work through and edit it, which is what actually creates your movie. Okay, so looking at import first. Now notice I tend to leave the copy files to Final Cut Pro events folder switched off. What that means is that there's a folder on the hard drive which you're working with called the events folder, which is where you store all your events, which is all your catalogued media broken up into various areas. Now, I hope I'm not going too quick, but I'll just keep going through it all and it will make sense as we go through. Okay, I do not wish to copy my media to the Final Cut Pro events folder. What that means is every bit of footage that you've filmed will be stored within this folder. I choose to use what's called referencing, which means I put my media on the hard drive, I know where it is, and Final Cut Pro then refers to that media. If you choose copy files to Final Cut Pro events folder, well then it will store all of the media within that area. That's something that I don't want to do. What it means is effectively you'll double up on your media. You'll have your original media which you've stored, and then you'll have the media which Final Cut Pro has put into the events folder. So I tend to keep my media in one place where it's accessible for me to get to, where I have defined, as opposed to choosing the Final Cut Pro events folder, which is where Final Cut Pro will choose to put everything if you were to check that option. Okay, see the option checked, option unchecked. So the way I choose to do things, the media will not be copied to the Final Cut Pro events folder. It will stay in the original location which you have defined. Okay, import folders as keyword collections. Now that's something I always leave checked. We're going to get onto keywording later, but basically keywording means labeling all of the footage which exists in your events. Now I'll just remind you, events is where you store your material within the Final Cut Pro interface. So once you've stored it there, it needs to be labeled and categorized, which is something you need to do. If you leave import folders as keyword collections checked, that means if your folder is labeled from the onset before you bring the material in, then once the material has been brought in, it will actually be labeled according to the folder that you'd put it in. So it's just a handy little way to catalog your media from the onset, assuming that you'd labeled your folders to begin with on hard drive. Okay, the other one I leave checked is create optimized media. Now, when working with media in Final Cut Pro X, it will either work with it in its native state or it will convert it to a format which is better for Final Cut Pro to work with, what we would call an edit-friendly type format. Now, a lot of media can be worked with in its original state. For example, XDCAM-EX, which is a format that I use a lot, XDCAM-EX can be used as XDCAM-EX Media Native. However, other formats such as AVC-HD, H.264, these are difficult formats to work with for the computer. So by checking Create Optimized Media, that will mean that that media will then be converted to another format which is easier for Final Cut Pro to work with, which will be ProRes. ProRes is basically the native editing format inside of Final Cut Pro. Now, you don't have to worry too much about all the technical details. Just remember that if the footage is hard for Final Cut Pro to work with, it will convert it to a format that is easier for it to use, which is why I leave Create Optimized Media on. The rest of the options in this area I leave switched off. Create Proxy Media, I wouldn't worry too much about that at this stage. It just means if you want to use low resolution files, by checking Create Proxy Media, when you bring content into Final Cut Pro, it will then convert it to a basically low bandwidth codec, which means it doesn't take up very much hard drive space and it's very efficient for the system to work with. So if you want to use Create Proxy Media, leave it switched on, but just be aware that Final Cut Pro X is then going to have quite a lot of converting to do to actually put that into the format of the proxy, which is the lightweight material for you to work with. I don't bother with it, I leave it switched off. But if you've got an older Mac and if you're having a lot of problems getting the system to work efficiently, that's something you may want to look at. Okay, the other options: analyze for balance color, find people. That means it's going to look through all your shots and find different heads of people and say that's a person, that will put those all into a specific area. I don't bother with any of this, I just leave it all switched off. And in terms of audio, analyze and fix audio problems, separate mono and group stereo audio, remove silent channels. These are all things you can do later once you're into the editing process, so I don't bother with any of those. Okay, so the only one I really worry about is import folders as keyword collections, and also the other one which I've got checked, which is Create Optimized Media. Okay, in terms of playback, you've got a bunch of choices here. You can choose to leave background render on. What this means is when you've got media within your timeline within Final Cut Pro X, which needs to be rendered, means you may have applied effects, you may have put a dissolve, you may have put audio effects onto a piece. It's all got to be treated by the computer for optimal playback and certainly for output. If you leave background render on, it means once you stop working for more than a few seconds, in this case 4 seconds is what is set, then Final Cut Pro X will automatically jump in and start rendering. I actually choose to leave this off a lot of the time, simply because Final Cut Pro X, at least on the machine I'm using, is pretty efficient and it works pretty well without needing to render the content. And generating render files, I would prefer to generate my render files when I need them, rather than have them being built all the time as soon as I stop working for a few seconds. But a lot of people like to work the other way, where Final Cut Pro X will render the instant you stop working, meaning for more than a couple of seconds, and then all content in the time will then be rendered so that you can basically see it at 100% quality at any time. That's the big difference between having rendered content and non-rendered content. Quite often, once it's rendered, you see it at beautiful, pristine quality. All the quality is there. When you're working with content which hasn't been rendered, very often that content will appear as lesser quality than it would have if it had been rendered. So the advantage to rendering is you get to see it in full quality. Okay, playback, use proxy media. I mentioned proxy media before. If you allow Final Cut Pro X on ingest, meaning bringing the content in, to basically turn all of the content into proxy media, that's the option there under import, well then, when you're playing back, you can actually use proxy media to actually play back the files, which means a lot less stress on the computer. Personally, I don't worry about working with proxy files most of the time. The system system works fine with the original media or with the transcoded media, so I pretty much leave it at that and don't use proxy media. However, the choice is there if you wish to. Okay, use original optimized media. I always leave this one checked. Now that refers back to the import area where I leave create optimized media checked. What that means is if you've generated, or if Final Cut Pro 10 I should say, has generated optimized media, then the optimized media will be used when the original media is difficult for the computer to work with. So just jumping back into import, I leave create optimized media checked, and then in playback I leave use original optimized media, which means the original media will be used when that is what's there to be worked with, and if optimized media has been generated, or the optimized media will be used. Now the next one down is quite important, playback quality. You can use high quality or better performance. I usually leave that set to better performance. Sometimes when you're using high quality, which means Final Cut Pro 10 is playing it back as well as it possibly can with all the quality that is accessible, sometimes the system has a few problems, mainly because of the throughput of data and just the amount of computational tasks that are being done at one time. So by dropping that down to better performance, it eases the load on the CPU of the computer basically, and it means that it will do the best it can to show you the content while dropping the quality as it needs to maintain the best performance. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It says use high quality or better performance, and better performance is referring to system performance. So I leave that to better performance. Okay, create optimized media for multicam clips. Now multicam is more for the advanced user, but I will say if you plan on editing multicam content, meaning 2, 3, 4 or more cameras at the same time as a multicam, meaning it lines them all up and you cut between the different angles of the cameras in a live type situations, well, it's advantageous to create optimized media for those multicam clips. So I leave that one checked. Okay, you can leave warn when drop frames during playback becomes apparent. What that means, if you leave the option checked, is that it will give you a warning that it's dropped frames while playing. If you switch it off, it will still play back fine. It's just there may be a little hiccup here or there where frames are dropped. It's not something to worry about too much. If you leave it on, it will give you the warning. If you leave it off, it will just keep playing. But the important thing is on output. It will render all the content and it will output pristine. So there'll be no drop frames on content once you'd actually exported the content out of Final Cut Pro as a complete file. And then there's another option, again, about warning drop frames, which is warn when frames are dropped due to hard disk performance. Okay, well, again, it will give you a warning if it's dropped frames. But again, I'll make the point, during output, once you'd exported the media through a process called share, then there will be no drop frames because it's actually created a complete file with all of the media intact. So even though there may be drop frames during playback, once the content is out of the system, meaning it's been exported through share, then it will be a complete file and it will play back fine. Okay, pre-roll duration, I don't worry too much about that. That's more for tape. If you're taking footage in from HDV or DV, it will pre-roll. I don't worry about that. And the other options, I just leave at the defaults. Now the editing preferences. Now most of these I leave at the defaults, but there are a few that I pay particular attention to. Now the timeline, show detailed trimming feedback, that's something I leave checked. It means once you get into the actual trimming side of things during the editing process, that you'll see a split window which will show the outgoing clip and the incoming clip. It's not a big deal at this stage, but once you do begin trimming, it can be very helpful. So I leave show detailed trimming feedback checked, and position playhead after edit operation. Now I always leave that one checked because that means once you've done an edit, the playhead, which is basically where you're parked in the timeline, will then be positioned after the edit. And I find that to be a big advantage because when you're editing, you're busy putting shots together. So usually I want to put the next shot after the shot that I'd already put into the timeline. So I leave position playhead after edit operation checked. Okay, audio, show reference waveforms. The more information that I can see in my audio, the better, so I want to see my reference waveforms. And I pretty much leave everything else at the default. Still images, well, when bringing stills into Final Cut Pro 10, when you bring them in, by default they will be 4 seconds. You can set that to whatever you want it to be. You can see there's various options under there. all in 1 second increments, and transition default length is 1 second. Well, that's fine. If I'm going to drop a dissolve in, a 1 second dissolve is a pretty good place to start. But of course you can change that default to whatever you want it to be. The option is there. Okay, that's just a quick run through preferences. Like I said, getting things set up at the onset correctly is really important. It can save you a lot of hassles later on. The most important of the preferences, just for a recap, in terms of import, I always leave import folders as keyword collections. Just to remind you, that's to do with organization, and I want to be as organized as I can be. Create optimized media, as I already said. If Final Cut Pro X finds the media that you're working with difficult to work with, it will transcode it to an edit-friendly format, which is ProRes. So leave those two options checked. In terms of playback, use original optimized media. I always leave that checked. And if you're going to be working with multicam clips, just to recap, I leave create optimized media for multicam clips. In editing, a few options I leave checked, the most important being show detailed trimming feedback, very useful for once you get into the trimming, and position playhead after edit operation, which, like I said, means that once you've done an edit, the actual where you are parked in the timeline, what is called the playhead, will then be put immediately after the edit, which I find very useful. But like I said, to be as organized as you can from the start is a good thing, and to me those are the most important of the areas.